schöne Gott der Funken, grüßt sie mit 4000 Mal. Tochter aus Elysium.
Okay, one more time.
In 1816, Beethoven revolutionized the tradition of Lieder, songs with poetic lyrics.
That was very beautiful, that German.
Okay, but let's do the transition one more time.
Because there was, you weren't quite together here on the bar before.
Okay, dann. Die dir klar. This is with Yadam Ba. Yeah?
Which transition?
For some, it's a song cycle. For others, it's the world's first concept album. Beethoven's and Die Ferne Geliebte. 6 songs tell the story of unrequited love in 15 minutes.
And the biggest invention is, for sure, the Ferne Geliebte, that he created really a song cycle. This is the first in music history, I would say, that he was composing a very long song, but with this kind of Zwischenspielen and no Vorspiel, no intro, very kind of powerful Nachspiel. But in fact, you have different kind of songs, different kind of episodes, and he is really telling a long story. This is really, for sure, the biggest invention in the aspect for the song repertoire.
With its sophisticated transitions, the piano does much more than merely accompany the singing voice.
The more I've discovered Beethoven's repertoire, the more I've come to appreciate that every one of his compositions is a masterwork in its own right. Regardless if they're lieder that aren't necessarily known to be the best leader in the world or not considered that way, but they're true genius. You just have to look for it.
And Die Ferne Geliebte became the model for all great song cycles of classical and romantic music. Franz Schubert adopted the close connection between piano and singing voice from Beethoven. Gustav Mahler expanded the idea and had the singer accompanied by an orchestra. One 150 years later, the idea was picked up in a completely different place. In the mid-1960s, pop music was revolutionized in the hills north of Hollywood. This is where the first concept albums were created, shedding pop's teeny bopper image and making it into a global million-dollar business.
Hollywood, lights, camera, action, home of the movie industry and also home of some of the most iconic pop songs ever produced.
One driving force was Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. His goal was to write mini-symphonies for kids. For his concept album Smile, he hired a young lyricist, the arranger and composer Van Dyke Parks. I read about your Good Vibration session. You suddenly said, we got to put a cello in there.
Yeah, put a cello. Eighth note triplets. fundamental eighth note triplets.
How did you come up with that idea?
God gave me a plan. And God gave me a plan that is that I would be a good arranger, come up with a good idea for something that had maybe a 2.5-minute time lapse. A signature, like the red ruby slippers, something to distinguish the Bank Dick's handshake. Play it again, Sam.
Your very first single. Ta-da. Van Dyke Parks released the first ever pop music version of Beethoven's Ode to Joy. This is your number 9, your very first solo single, and it's Beethoven. Tell me why. Why Beethoven for this?
I would tell you, I knew what I loved, and I loved that music that Beethoven, I understand, had adapted and defined. In the Ninth Symphony, I was knocked out by that. And then there's that piece, and that piece was probably the first time that it dawned on me that somebody was extrapolating something from an idiom, a folk idiom, roots music. That made a big dent in my life. And I just immediately, pre-teen, had bifurcated conveniently the nexus of the street and the elite, the music that came from the street that found its way into the parlors and so forth. Gottschalk, for example, on an American scale.
Thanks to Van Dyke Parks, Beethoven became a kind of folk rock pioneer, at the same time that Bob Dylan was making folk rock popular around the world.
I've got Beethoven on this shoulder here. I've got the absolute nihilists here. Bob Dylan's Sprechstimme, which outsprecht any Stimme I have ever heard before. He's the master of it. It's undeniable that pop music is attractive because it has a physicality, and it recognizes the eurythmic appeal in music. And that's what Beethoven, and certainly Brahms on steroids, had for me.
Brian Wilson and Van Dyke Parks shared an ambitious vision. Rather than a simple collection of tracks, Smile was to be a song cycle telling the history of the United States, carefully composed right down to the last detail. Smile wasn't released in its entirety until decades later, but the idea was quickly copied by the world's most successful bands. Right next door in Laurel Canyon, Frank Zappa created his concept album, Freak Out. And in England, the Beatles were also inspired by Smile. They invented a fictitious music group, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The British band The Who released a rock opera called Tommy. And Pink Floyd's concept album, The Dark Side of the Moon, about a descent into madness, became one of the most successful albums in music history. And this is something you've used in your music ever since. Beethoven wrote the very first song cycle ever, Die Ferne Geliebte. And funnily enough, and this is why I really wanted to talk to you about this is what you've been doing. This is what you did immediately after your album with Song Cycle.
Well, okay, this is interesting, but that was imposed upon me by the medium. The medium was the album, and the album had a constituent elapsed time.
This concept
album. Yeah, the concept album did come out of Laurel Canyon, to be sure. All of those people. To numerous to mention, although Zappa was there in Tom Mix's cabin, which is burned to the ground. Other groups, Joni Mitchell and Crosby, Stills and Nash and all of this stuff. Everybody in Laurel Canyon had the idea, though, that the concept album, that is, since people were now listening to the album, it was a technological advancement. We were at the gilded age of the analog recording, and that album form provided that continuity that people sought. And it became a discipline, and a pro form, everything had to be just so. For example, you had to think about the first cut. You had to think about the last cut. You had to think about the amount of time, thinking about the amount of time it would take to turn it over and get to the B side, what the first cut would be, and how would it end, and did you want to build or evaporate?
On his 1968 concept album, Song Cycle, Dyke Parks explored the myth of California from the splendid national parks to the artificiality of Hollywood.
The crack of the backbeat on Vine Street.
When you did your own song cycle, Beethoven, he described water, running water and woods and birdsong in his music. You were lucky you were recording analog and you could put the sounds of the water and stuff in there.
That's right. I wanted to do that, so I felt that it was unavoidable. But the most interesting component was when I decided not to write the song called Vine Street. I'd lived on Vine Street.
There's Beethoven in there too.
And there is Beethoven, and Randy Newman put that in there because of that disc. So, you know, this is my Rosebud. Beethoven is bigger than Rosebud to me.
Your most recent album, Spangled, it's also a concept. You've decided to put famous Pan-American songs together with a reason. And what has kept you on this track?
In my case, it's people around me.
Gaby Moreno.
One of the people around Dyke Parks is Grammy winner Gaby Moreno, a singer-songwriter from Guatemala. She and Dyke wrote the concept album Spangled. The song cycle evokes the time where there was still a lively cultural exchange between Latin America and the USA, with neither hatred nor border walls.
There's a place where I've been told every street is paved with gold, and it's just across the borderline.
This idea of having a concept, is this something you've consciously tried to do in your own stuff, or did this come through the work with Dyke Parks?
I've always thought that, you know, it's important for me to think of an album like from beginning to end. Like, ideally, in an ideal scenario, you want people to listen to it from beginning to end.
Did you have the concept before, or did the concept come while you were looking for the pieces?
I remember at first it was a lot of songs in Spanish. So Nube Gris, he started sending me that one, which ended up on the record. Historia de un Amor. And then I can't remember quite well, but I think he just sent me Across the Borderline, which is a song written by Ry Cooder and John Hyatt in the 1980s. So he sent me that song, and I was like, and something sparked in me. I said, okay, this, I get it, we get it. This is the concept. We're gonna do a record that celebrates not only the cultures in Latin America, but also the US, and try to like unite the North and the South and Central America, and think of it, because in Guatemala, I always say this, like in Guatemala, they teach us that the continent is America, you know, one continent. So it was important for me to like just reflect that on this record, where we're celebrating the wonderful music that comes from all these different parts of America.
Singer-songwriting legend Jackson Browne joined the celebrations.
The Rio Grande, 1,000 footprints in the sand reveal a secret no one can define.
Warm white at Rio Frutte.
The river flows on like a breath in between our life and death. Tell me who'll be next to cross the borderline.
Politics is another thing that really appealed to me, and Beethoven's maverick status.
It encouraged you.
It encouraged me.
Auf dem Hügel sieht sie spähend in das blaue Nebelland. Nach den Fernen Triften sehend, wo ich dich, Geliebte, fand.
It's incredible how much Beethoven has shaped our music world. Whether in jazz, film scores, or rock music, his innovations and ideas are everywhere.